Hey guys, Alex here. So back in the fourth episode, we talked about group small insight being the basic principles of trying to play Othello. Today, we would like to talk about basic mid-game principles in terms of how you can actually guide your moves with further intention. So today, I'll introduce you some basic mid-game principles that you can further your game. Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about basic mid-game principles. So even though this episode is part of the intermediate lesson, I'd like to share with you that perhaps in Othello, even though some may think that the end game is probably the most difficult part, but personally I feel that perhaps the opening part is the easiest, followed by the end game, which has fixed ways to complete the game, fixed sequences. But I think the mid game is actually the one that really dictates most of how the game will actually play out. So if you do have like a weak opening but a very strong mid game, you can actually win back the game or win back the situation. So I think the mid game is arguably the hardest part of the game to master. So today we're going to be talking about some basic principles to the mid game, but ironically, there's nothing really basic to actually applying it all the time accurately. So this is in Athens, Greece. This is the Acropolis. So let's just go into the topics for today. So today's topics are prevention, poison and unpoison, and taking the move. Now let's talk about prevention. So they always say that prevention is better than cure, and the same applies in Othello as well. So prevention, or also otherwise known as evaporation, probably to the Japanese Othello players, is about preventing your opponent from getting a good move. So previously we've already defined a good move to be generally quiet moves whereby you probably flip a disc generally in one direction or just make minimal impact on the board, just flipping discs that are inside within the group of discs that are existing on the board so that you don't really create moves for your opponent. So over here, essentially, black has just played f5 and flipped e4. That's a good move for black. And of course, the next consequent good move for black would be to actually consider playing f6, which essentially utilizes his d4 disc to just flip one disc in one direction and just maintain that center shape so that you avoid creating too many moves for your opponent. So this is actually the Sakaguchi opening, and this is probably one of the best openings to actually demonstrate prevention and how it goes. So over here, it is now white's turn to play, and essentially, if you are white and you're looking for a good move to play, you might consider maybe e2. But in Othello, besides thinking of where you should play that could be potentially a good move, you should also think in a more passive manner in terms of where your opponent might be playing next and how you could actually just try to prevent it. So in this case, the good move for black is what we highlighted earlier, f6, and of course the disc that is giving that access is d4. So in prevention, what you want to do for white is essentially to remove this disc. So your options would then be b4, d2, or f2. All three moves essentially removes d4. And of course c3 also removes. But of course c3 flips 4 discs in 3 different directions, and d2 flips 3 discs in 2 different directions. So in general, there isn't that need to actually take on that risk. And instead, you should just take on the cleanest move would be either f2 or b4. And of course, b4 is quite a common book move for the Sakaguchi opening. So definitely b4 is the best move over here. So we'll go ahead with b4. And of course, having that excess removed for black would then just try to look for an excess to actually control this center axis. So black could choose to either capture e5 disc in order to look for that good move to c3, or to capture the d4 disc to look for that same good move back to f6. So of course, if you wanted to capture e5, that would probably mean playing something like b5, which is flipping 5 discs in 3 different directions. That wouldn't be too good for black. And of course, the other option for black is to play d7, which is essentially the book best move and one of the more common moves, to just play to down and then you flip 3 discs in one direction to reinstate that d4 disc as black and find that access back to f6. And of course, one more step further is for white to consider a further prevention and removal of this d4 disc by either playing the c3 or f2. And of course, c3 being a move that flips maybe 3 discs in 2 different directions versus f2, which flip 2 discs in one direction. Perhaps f2 is the more economical choice in terms of retaining more moves. So that is essentially the best move for book, I believe. And of course, right now, there isn't a nice way for black to gain back that d4 disc to insist on actually playing f6. So it's essentially the board sort of rotates and changes the orientation. And then now suddenly e2 is probably a good move for black to actually capture the e5 disc in order to go for a good move to c3. And in this case, white could essentially opt to prevent it at c7, which is further removing that e5 disc, or to actually jump into c3 to actually take the move. After making black go on that wild goose chase, you actually just take the move right in front of him, and you basically just block whatever that he wants to play. And then make him earn probably good moves elsewhere, or just try to work around the shape. So that essentially is all about prevention, and of course, prevention occurs in different shapes and sizes on the board for different openings. So definitely, there isn't a particular model that can, give you a full-fledged, 100% perfect, complete solution to actually identifying these moves. But instead, you would definitely have to just learn by experience and also just try to identify good moves for your opponent and work from there. So now let's talk about poisoning and unpoisoning. So what exactly is poison in Othello? So poison in Othello actually means poisoning that move, which basically means making that particular move that your opponent is probably predicted to make, or a good move that is obvious to make it less attractive, and to basically sort of force your opponent to consider other options. So let's take a look at this example. So over here, it is now white's turn to play, and a very obvious, easy, good move for white is to essentially just capture h4 over here, which is a quiet move. Although it flips 2 discs in 2 different directions, the 2 discs are basically nestled within all the existing discs, including the one that white is about to make. So when white plays this move, it is a very good move for white to actually just continue on. So next target for white essentially is to actually just play h3 next, to just continue to skim moves off the edge. So right now, black has an opportunity to actually just regroup his discs together to g3. And by playing g3, black essentially makes h3, which originally only requires white to flip 1, 2, 3 discs along the diagonal, this mini diagonal at least, which was originally an attractive move for white, is now a very unattractive move for white because white has to flip 1, 2, 3, 4 more white discs due to its disc on c3, and of course the connection that black just made on g3. So suddenly h3 is totally devalued because black filled in the gap by playing g3. So that essentially is poisoning h3. So it's also known as poisoning the move in Othello. And of course, it basically makes h3 very, very unattractive. So let's talk about unpoisoning then. So the main reason why h3 is unattractive is because there is a white disc along this third row. So let's talk about what happens if, let's say, white were to choose not to play any of the moves to the top, and assuming that white does play a5, for example, and for some reason black chooses to play, let's say, b3. If black chooses to play b3, essentially he clears out that entire third row and basically unpoisons h3 for white. So with that now cleared up, white can happily just take that move to h3 with consecutive tempo to h2 in the future as well. So that would actually be a terrible move for black to actually unpoison white to make consecutive moves. So that is one example of poisoning and unpoisoning. So since poisoning and unpoison comes in all different shapes and sizes in Othello games, I'd like to share another example to just simply illustrate a cause and effect. So probably one of my favorite ways to actually convey this poison and unpoison concept is the head and tail theory. So let's just assume that right now it's black's turn to play and black plays g6, which flips 4 discs that are actually nestled between most of the existing discs on the board. Doesn't really create any more new moves for your opponent per se, but by doing this move, which is the head, on the tail end of it, there is a chance, because when black plays a move and flips a continuous row of discs, basically the tail end of it is actually a high chance of establishing a quiet move in Othello. So I like to call this a head and tail theory, but really it's just unpoisoning and poison. So essentially, once black has cleared out the entire row over here, he has essentially unpoisoned the a6 move for white. As compared to the original situation where if white were to play a6, he has to flip 1 and 2 discs in 2 different directions. But now that black has played g6, for example, suddenly white can now play a quiet a6, which essentially black has unpoisoned this move for a6, for white to actually play into a6. So as you play Othello, you will then realize that most of the board situation involves a lot of poison and unpoison, because every single move requires you to flip some discs. And by flipping those discs, it is important to actually be aware of what exactly, or what moves exactly are you unlocking or unpoisoning for your opponent to actually play to, and whether that flow of the game will actually work in your favor or not after the tempo exchanges have been made. So with that, I'll move on to the next concept about taking the move. So right now I'd like to talk about taking the move. So if you look at the entire contents of this episode, it was structured in a way that it was prevention first, followed by poison or unpoison, and then taking the move. So similarly in a game, usually prevention takes first priority, and then of course poisoning it, and then finally taking the move, which is also known as blocking, if I'm not wrong, perhaps among the Japanese or other materials. So basically, in this situation, I like to bring you back into the Sakaguchi opening after a few preventions have been made by essentially white, and up to this point. So in every situation where you try to prevent your opponent's good move, there is always a limit where the prevention cost becomes too high because of the nature of how the board or the discs are shaped at that position. So in this situation here, if white were to try to actually consider continuously to prevent black from actually obtaining the c3 nice move that he has by removing the e5 disc, white would then have to consider options such as g5, f6, or maybe c7. So if you look at f6, we can almost immediately eliminate that choice because it is flipping 4 discs in 3 different directions. So that is probably something you wouldn't want, and you would then create a block shape with a whole lot of many options for black to play to. And then of course g5 being 3 discs in one direction does prevent it, which is an option to consider, but you want to consider that the 3 discs that you flip, 2 discs are having a lot of exposed squares to the outside. Are you then creating too many moves for your opponent? And then of course finally c7, which is somewhat of a clean cut as well to remove that excess, but it forms a dispersive shape, and it also unpoisons this position for black to play a nice move to g3, perhaps with that continuous diagonal row that white has cut out from c7 using a head and tail theory, you would then know that this being the head as the last move, the tail end of it could be a quiet move for black. So that is another thing you want to consider. And also when you form a long shape to the left, to the bottom left, is it easily penetrable by black to actually centralize? So do you want to do that? So usually if prevention up to a certain limit of poisoning is not possible, what you want to do is essentially to snatch the move right in front of your opponent before your opponent gets it. Of course, you would then also have to assess the cost, whether that is too much to do or is that totally fine. Instead of allowing black to play c3 move, you then push him to probably c2 or d2 instead by taking the move. So in this case, the book move and the best move is indeed, in fact, c3, which is the perfect example for actually assessing the situation and taking the move. So with that, I basically conclude all three basic mid-game principles. Just to add on a bonus content, the fourth point, which actually works for a mid-game apart from these three principles, are essentially ignoring the approach. So if you do find that you're in a situation and you try to consider all three approaches for prevention, poisoning, or taking the move, and if all three doesn't work, you should try to adopt an alternative approach by ignoring that approach. But by ignoring it, it doesn't really mean that you entirely just become oblivious of the situation on the board, but instead you try to work your way around, allowing your opponent to take that move that he wants, but in exchange you try to gain tempo elsewhere. So on that note, I'll end off this episode, and thank you for watching this video. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next one.